What does anarchism look like in practice? Ursula K. Guin gives us a detailed examination of that question in the Dispossessed, along with a constellation of issues stemming from it. Anarchism is hard to pin down, in large part because it's defined by the absence of something, rulers, rather than any positive trait or program. There's a sort of de facto anarchy of simply not having anyone in charge, sort of the natural state of humanity, where we're each our own master with complete freedom of action limited only by physical limitations and the actions of others, and we have to work things out with other people on that one-to-one basis. And then there's ideological anarchism, the rejection of existing hierarchical systems of control and the stating of principles to be implemented instead. De facto anarchism just is, while ideological anarchism is reacting to what is. The Dispossessed is a great examination of ideological anarchism, a society of people committed to the principle of a leaderless, propertyless society, and the ways in which ideals crash into the hard wall of implementation. So the setup. Two worlds. Urras, an Earth-like planet with populous industrialized nation-states and competing socioeconomic systems where 150 years ago a group of dissidents nominally led by a political philosopher named Odo were allowed to leave for Anarres, a habitable but rather austere planet in a shared orbit. These Odonians built a society without rulers, without the tyranny of masters and subordinates, without property. A free and equal society. The only contact between the two worlds is through limited trade via a single spaceport, walled off from the rest of Anarres. No visitors, no communications save for a tightly controlled exchange of academic texts. But before diving into that, there's an important factor we have to take into account when looking at the anarchist society of Anarres, as exemplified by the cargo ships that cycle between the two worlds. The freighters from Urras came in only 8 times a year and stayed just long enough to load and unload. They were not welcome visitors. Indeed, they were, to some anarchists, a perpetually renewed humiliation. They brought fossil oils and petroleum products, certain delicate machine parts and electronic components that anarchist manufacturing was not geared to supply, and often a new strain of fruit tree or grain for testing. They took back to Urras a full load of mercury, copper, aluminum, uranium, tin, and gold. It was for them a very good bargain. The division of their cargoes 8 times a year was the most prestigious function of the Urasti Council of World Governments and the major event of the Urasti World Stock Market. In fact, the free world of Anarres was a mining colony of Urras. Anarres exists within the context of a broader capitalist society. They can't be looked at in isolation, they're part of a larger system. And this is often overlooked in discussion of our own history. The world, for the last few hundred years, has been dominated by a capitalist system. Sometimes this means industrialization as a producer, sometimes exploitation as a source of raw materials, much like Anarres. But the part that really rustles some jimmies is that communist countries, even the mighty Soviet Union, existed within a capitalist global order. So, for example, Stalin's industrialization push was dependent on outside sources of expertise, machinery and materials. During the 1920s, the Soviet Union purchased industrial machinery and hired experts from America. During the 1930s, they traded oil and raw materials to Germany in exchange for machine tools. During the war, the Soviet Union was heavily reliant on refined metals, agricultural products, and machine tooling from the United States in exchange for the Red Army bearing the brunt of the fighting. Post-war trade relationships carried on, socialist or communist states existing within the globo-cap system. It was a connected system, with the socialist experiment existing within and at least partially dependent on a broader capitalist world from which it acquired things it needed. Any discussion of socialism, communism, or the particular incarnation of anarcho-communism depicted in this book has to look beyond its own borders because it isn't a closed system, at least economically. Ideologically is another matter. This is why the people of Anarres are so resistant to the idea of open communication with Urras. We experience both worlds through the eyes of Shevek, a physicist and native of Anarres who travels to Urras amidst a bit of controversy. They want him because he's on the verge of a new model of physics, one that may even open the way for faster-than-light travel. He wants to go because he's compelled to see how people on Urras live, to open a dialogue with them. Even before he's able to articulate it, he doesn't fully buy into the assumptions of his own society. Something is off. There's a disconnect between theory and practice. His confusion intensifies as soon as he's on the spacecraft that will take him across to Urras. Little things like packaging and pajamas are new to him. He was putting on his old clothes, and as he pulled the shirt over his head, he saw the doctor stuff the blue and yellow sleeping clothes into the trash bin. The clothes are burned? Oh, those are cheap pajamas, service issue. Wear them and throw them away. It costs less than cleaning. It costs less, Shevek repeated meditatively. He said the words the way a paleontologist looks at a fossil, the fossil that dates a whole stratum. Urras has several nation-states, ranging from the liberal social democratic type with AIO to the totalitarian Thu. None of them are entirely forthcoming with him, despite putting on a show of openness and information. A group of people in Benbili sent us a message on the syndicate wavelength not long before I left Abane. They called themselves Odonians. Are there any such groups here in AIO? Not that I ever heard of, Dr. Shevek. The wall. Shevek knew the wall by now when he came up against it. He quickly realizes that he's in a controlled environment, insulated in academia. Shevek works with physicists from all these states, all of whom naturally have their own agendas, both personal and ideological. But this isn't simply a comparison of the two societies, anarchism versus various statist models. It's a dissection of how the specifically propertyless anarchist system actually works for the people that live in it, and how adherence to the principles of anarchism can sometimes get in the way of freedom. Ideals become laws of their own accord. Odonian society takes their abolition of property quite seriously. People have personal effects, of course, but they don't have private homes. There are dormitories, couples can sign out private rooms, but truly private space of one's own is frowned upon. There were a good many solitaries and hermits on the fringes of the older Anarresti communities, pretending that they were not members of a social species. But for those who accepted the privilege and obligation of human solidarity, privacy was of value only where it served a function. This is a great example of principle getting in its own way. I don't think it's overstating things to say it's an unnatural arrangement. I mean, bears and tigers don't own anything, but they are territorial. Wander into a bear's den and you're probably going to be treated like you're breaking into somebody's house. There's this very natural core to the concept of property that a lot of communist ideologies deliberately ignore, which kind of leads to them trying to build the entire ideology on a cracked foundation. And this natural territorial urge presents itself in Anarresti society in various ways despite the cultural taboos that have been built up around it. Shevek sat down across the room, clearing a pile of papers off a bench to do so. The physics office was of course communal, but Sabul kept his back room of the two littered with materials he was using so that there never seemed to be quite room for anyone else. And while ideologically anarchist, they have a social control structure as rigid as any legalistic statist one. They just disperse the enforcement authorities so widely that there's no one to direct opposition against. They have many enforcement mechanisms, for example, what are essentially struggle sessions. Bedap's conversation was all too much like a criticism session, the communal activity he had always liked least, when everybody stood up and complained about defects in the functioning of the community and usually defects in the characters of the neighbors. They speak their own language, Pravic, created by the dissidents that settled Anarres. It's an ideologically constructed language that attempts to shape thought by directing vocabulary. For example, when Shevek arrives to study under Sabul, one of the prominent physicists of Anarres, he receives a carefully phrased warning. I don't know Sabul well, I know nothing against him, but keep this in mind. You will be his man. The singular forms of the possessive pronoun in Pravic were used mostly for emphasis. Idiom avoided them. Little children might say my mother, but very soon they learn to say the mother. Instead of my hand hurts, it was the hand hurts me, and so on. To say this one is mine and that one's yours in Pravic, one said I use this one and you use that. Midas' statement, you will be his man, had a strange sound to it. These and other pieces come together in a control mechanism that exerts immense force on the individual, but does it so evenly that many of them just accept it as coming from the sparse world they inhabit. We don't cooperate, we obey. We fear being outcast, being called lazy, dysfunctional, egoizing. We fear our neighbor's opinion more than we respect our own freedom of choice. You don't believe me, Tack, but try, just try stepping over the line, just in imagination, and see how you feel. We have created crime, just as the proprietarians did. We force a man outside the sphere of our approval and then condemn him for it. We've made laws of conventional behavior, built walls all around ourselves, and we can't see them because they're part of our thinking. Language shapes perception to some extent, and when language becomes a tool more for excluding ideas rather than expressing them, it starts to break down because we still have those ideas, still feel those things, even without the words to clearly express them. For example, the carefully crafted Pravic vocabulary around sex. The usual verb, taking only a plural subject, can be translated only by a neutral word like copulate. This frame of words could not contain the totality of experience any more than any other, and Shevek was aware of the area left out, though he wasn't quite sure what it was. Also noteworthy that Pravic uses the same word for both work and play. All of this points to the society on Anarres being anarchist in only the most doctrinal sense, not having a formal governing authority. But it's crafted to narrow thought and action to such an extent that it's not a particularly free society. And even that lack of government is debatable. The network of administration and management is called PDC, Production and Distribution Coordination. They are a coordinating system for all syndicates, federatives, and individuals who do productive work. They do not govern persons, they administer production. An echo of Marxist language, the government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, as Engels wrote. In practice, this tends toward treating people as a component of production, as things. But you can't seriously talk of a government here. Tomar's definitions, government, the legal use of power to maintain and extend power. Replace legal with customary and you've got Sabul and the Syndicate of Instruction and the PDC. The PDC is by now basically an anarchistic bureaucracy. Every discussion I've ever had about anarchism spirals around this conflict between the necessary administrative functions and division of labor versus the tendency for such structures to ossify into governing bodies exerting power over people. Everyone but the anarchists end up saying that anarchy is impossible because human nature or something, and the anarchists, like the Odonians and the Dispossessed, try to come up with some systematized form of anarchy that prevents power structures from accreting. Both miss something vital. Human societies are dynamic systems. They require tension. The optimal condition of society is not stability, but a balance of opposing forces. And Odonian society on Anarres has lost that tension through a combination of ideological rigidity and scrupulous isolationism. They've created a governing system hiding in plain sight. It's not the individuals posted to the PDC, Shev. Most of them are like us, all too much like us, well-meaning, naive. And it's not just PDC, it's anywhere on Anarres, learning centers, institutes, mines, mills, fisheries, canneries, agricultural development and research stations, factories, one-product communities, anywhere that function demands expertise in a stable institution. But that stability gives scope to the authoritarian impulse. In the early years of settlement, we were aware of that, on the lookout for it. People discriminated very carefully then between administering things and governing people. They did it so well that we forgot that the will to dominate is as central in human beings as the impulse to mutual aid is, and has to be trained in each individual in each new generation. Nobody's born an Odonian any more than he's born civilized, but we've forgotten that. Or, putting it another way, I like the idea of anarchism, of not having government, because it always abuses power. I don't like the idea of communism because I think some level of private property is necessary for a healthy society. People like having their own spaces, and they like to win at things. Neither anarchism nor communism can work in some ideological pure strain form, but it's good to have anarchists and communists in the world, pushing for their vision, even if it is unworkable, because it forces us to think about the society we have and slows down the concentrating of power and wealth. Invalid answers don't invalidate the questions. Anarres isn't real anarchism. The people have slipped into a groove and they just accept the establishment order, pretending that they're big rebels while doing what they're told. We keep our initiative tucked away, safe in our mind, like a room where we can come and say, I don't have to do anything, I make my own choices, I'm free. And then we leave the little room in our mind and go where PDC posts us and stay till we're reposted. As an American, I'm well aware of the irony here. Not living up to ideals and pretending to be free is a national sport. During his time on Anarres, Shevek is able to attenuate some of his views on his own society. The problems of it look different in context of the wider civilization he's part of. Anarres is not a closed system, it's connected to the nation-states of Urras in various ways. He slips from the controlled environment of the university into the poor areas of the city. Working class people, vagrants, and revolutionaries, the latter of whom have drawn inspiration from Anarres for generations. Do you know what your society has meant here to us these last 150 years? Do you know that when people here want to wish each other luck, they say, may you get reborn on Anarres? To know that it exists, to know that there is a society without government, without police, without economic exploitation, that they can never say again that it's just a mirage, an idealist dream. They don't know about the famine on Anarres that required planet-wide labor assignments, separating families for years. They don't feel the weight of the alternative forms of social coercion that so vexed Shevek. How fragile that society was when faced merely with the prospect of communication with Urras. Shevek and some associates formed a syndicate specifically to engage in information exchange via radio, and it quickly resulted in social ostracizing of Shevek and his family, harassment, and threats of direct violence. When the prospect of his going to Urras was first raised, it was met with vehement opposition. If there are people here that don't like Anarres, let them go. I'll help. I'll carry them to the port. I'll even kick them there. But if they try to come sneaking back, there's going to be some of us there to meet them, some real Adonians, and they won't find us smiling and saying, welcome home, brothers. They'll find their teeth kicked down their throats and their balls kicked up into their bellies. There are similar arguments with the various revolutionaries Shevek meets on Urras. Some are pacifists, others intent on violent uprising. They settle on a general strike. A strike that is swiftly crushed with heavy police action. Anarchists are notoriously bad at organizing skilled military forces for obvious reasons. Shevek escapes the carnage and eventually finds refuge in the Terran embassy. And suddenly he's on the other side of the legalistic games. When he was hiding in a warehouse from a government death squad, the complete lack of legal structure on his homeworld seemed like a much better social arrangement. Sure, some goons might try to beat his ass if he ever goes back, but it's just a mob and his own buddies can back him up in an epic brawl. It's very different from being hunted by an organized paramilitary force trying to kill you. But now, in the embassy, he's protected by the same legal fictions, as confusing as those games are to him. A delightful fantasy of diplomats, this castle 11 light years from my Earth, this room in a tower in Rodered in Aio on the planet Urras of the Sun Tau Ceti is Terran soil. But Shevek isn't there for asylum. He's worked out his theory, a new physics that shows the way not only to faster-than-light travel eventually, but real-time interstellar communications in very short order. He and the engineers are confident of that, and he wants to give it away. To everyone. Anarres, Urras, and the other races they're in contact with, the Terrans and the Hainish. The Terran ambassador is rather excited at the prospect. It would make a League of Worlds possible, a federation. We have been held apart by the years, the decades between leaving and arriving, between question and response. It's as if you had invented human speech. We can talk. At last we can talk together. And what will you say? The government of AIO wanted it not for what it would allow them to do as much as what it would give them the power to do that no one else could. It's about a power and wealth disparity rather than power and wealth itself. Because wealth isn't bad, Shevek understands that. It's the wide gap between rich and poor, the fact that some feast while others starve. That's what troubles him. And he gives away his life's work. He did the work in pursuit of knowledge, and knowledge is for all people, not just the rich or the government. But the end of the story is less overt. Shevek returns to Anarres, but he doesn't arrive alone. An ambassador from the Hainish, one of the alien races with an embassy on Urras, comes with him. Not as a diplomat, but just as a man wanting to live among them and learn their ways, to know them and to exchange knowledge. It's the beginning of Anarres becoming a real society, part of a wider world, rather than some long-running political science experiment that needs to be kept isolated. It's not that they're abandoning anarchism. It's that their anarchism is maturing enough to recognize its own flaws, to relax the rigid rules it denies it has, and interact with other people who have radically different worldviews. An acknowledgement that they don't live in an intellectual or economic vacuum, but are part of a larger, more complex world. It's going to change them in ways they can't anticipate, but they will change the others too. Okay, I'm finally going to do it. Shameless plug for Ninti's Gate, a tale of war and political machinations in a more de facto anarchist society that's slowly ossifying into a state. Link in the description.